Okay, I just want to make sure we are recording. We are recording. Okay. Welcome to the virtual web broadcasting of the Public Safety Assessment, PSA, an example of the next generation of pretrial risk assessment. My name is Ken Rose, and I will be the moderator for today's broadcast. This event was made possible by the Virginia Community Criminal Justice Association's, VCCJA, Pretrial Justice Advancement Committee, known as PJAC. The idea for this project came from PJAC as an effort to keep the pretrial risk assessment conversation going. Virginia has a long history and nationally recognized history of advancing the development implementation of pretrial risk assessment. We did this by developing and implementing and validating the vPRA. Since we first implemented the vPRA in the early 2000s, many jurisdictions throughout the United States have implemented the vPRA, from California, Oregon, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Florida, North Carolina, and others we haven't heard from. There's also been additional pretrial risk assessment research and development that has led to the development of tools used nationally. Those tools include the Ohio tool, known as the ORAS, and the Public Safety Assessment, the PSA, which we'll be talking about today. And that research and that development and implementation has been done through Arnold Ventures and Advancing Pretrial Policy and Research, APPR. So just some quick introductions today. Our panel members include Nick Sainer, the co-founder of Justice Point, and he's situated in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Wes Smallwood, the program manager from OAR Jefferson Area Community Corrections. And again, I'm Ken Rose, and I'll moderate today's broadcast, and I'm from the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services. So real quick, just to the panel members, if you want to kind of tell us a little bit more about yourself before we get going. And Nick, I'll start with you.
Sure. So thanks, Ken. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me today. And certainly excited to have this conversation with you and Wes. Like Ken said, I'm the co-founder of Justice Point. Justice Point's a nonprofit organization that provides pretrial and diversion services throughout the state of Wisconsin, and we've recently expanded into the state of Minnesota. I also serve as the president of the National Association of Pretrial Service Agencies Board of Directors. I'm very excited and honored to represent the entire field in that regards as well. My experience with the PSA really stems from Milwaukee County, our practice over the last decade, but then also we are involved in the expansion of counties in the state of Wisconsin where they're going to be implementing the PSA as well. So I'm excited to be here, and thank you, Ken, for inviting me.
Absolutely, thank you.
And I'm Wes Smallwood. I am the program manager for our pretrial services program in Orange, Virginia, our satellite office with OAR Jefferson Area Community Corrections here in Central Virginia. And that's my so the co-chair of Virginia Pretrial Justice Advancement Committee, better known as PJAC. And so that's, thank you, Ken, for reaching out to have me participate with this as well. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, thank you. So, well, Wes, I guess let's talk about, how did we arrive here? How did we get here? Why is it important to do this web broadcast today?
Yeah, so part of our monthly committee meetings with PJAC, we identified a lot of opportunities for us to continually examine the tools that we are using. There's been a lot of national conversation about risk assessments, as well as some states who have enacted pretty large criminal justice reform at the pretrial stage. And so part of our group took a trip to New Jersey to observe their newly implemented statewide criminal justice reform. There has also been a statewide crime commission study of pretrial services and the pretrial system in Virginia. I believe started in 2018 or 2017, around that time. And it's evolved into a more system-wide approach instead of primarily focused on pretrial services. And so PJAC, we have done a lot of work, and what we would like to see as an ideal framework for an ideal pretrial justice system and what that could look like in Virginia. And part of that conversation process internally as pretrial services agencies, and what that could look like as we move forward through developing the ideal pretrial justice system in Virginia, and looking into New Jersey, open our eyes to the PSA, as well as conversations about that, and just looking at, is the tool that we are using, is it the most appropriate, and just what are some of these other tools that are out there, specifically the PSA, and what does that mean? And so that's sort of stemmed conversation into this direction, to where we are here today, having a conversation just about the PSA in general, what it looks like, how it's implemented, and some of the comparative pros and cons maybe between vPRA versus PSA. And that's sort of how we arrived here today as a committee and state, really, and how that all played out.
So Wes, before we get too far along in talking about the PSA and the vPRA comparisons, I think one of the important things is to kind of establish or anchor ourselves in the role and purpose of pretrial, and the Code of Virginia addresses that. Can you walk us through a little bit about what the Code of Virginia says in terms of the role, what's our primary role, and what it says about risk assessment, and the context of that, and how we've implemented pretrial services in Virginia and the model that we use?
Sure. So as you see, pretrial agencies are a major function and role of pretrial services is to inform judicial officers in making better informed decisions relating to risk of pretrial failure, risk to public safety, and determining whether or not an individual will reappear in court. That is a primary charge of our officers, to be able to provide that information to the courts and to the judicial officers making those decisions about release. And so, what we do is we utilize a risk assessment tool, which by code, the Department of Criminal Justice Services, where you are employed, they are charged with making sure that we have a risk assessment instrument tool by which we do that, by which we inform those judicial officers and provide additional information to them. And so for us, in our state, where we come in as pretrial services officers or investigators, that comes in after someone has been brought in front of a magistrate. We have a magistrate system in Virginia. And so a magistrate has made a determination to either detain, set a secured bond, or release an individual. And if that person is detained in one of our jails, at that point, pretrial services would then enter the picture, potentially interview those defendants for eligibility for pretrial risk assessment. We would then implement or investigate them and conduct the risk assessment with the vPRA and present that to the judicial officers or the judges at their initial appearance or bond hearings. And so there is that somewhat of a gap that occurs between the magistrate. It is not something that is implemented at the magistrate level at this point in Virginia. And so that's currently our model and how we operate, and where pretrial services interacts with those defendants in the system.
Nick, I'm going to ask you a quick question, and I hope I'm not throwing you a curveball, but from your perspective at NABSA, is it common that other state statutes have language regarding a pretrial risk assessment? Well, and for that matter, the role and duties of pretrial services. But anything specific is there a trend about that one way or the other?
There's definitely, yeah, Ken, there definitely is a trend towards adding statutory language supporting the activities of pretrial service agencies. The one that I'm obviously most familiar with is the movement in Kentucky that happened, gosh, it might be 20 years ago. I might have that time frame off a little bit. There are obviously some really strong pros and cons. One of the things I think Kentucky has learned is that sometimes being too specific is not necessarily great when you're statutorily mandating a specific risk assessment tool, except for instead of using broad language saying that this is the role and function of pretrial services and pretrial service agencies within the specific scope of the criminal justice system.
Excellent, thank you. Well, so talking about NAPSA, NAPSA has just released their new update to their national standards for pretrial services agencies. And in looking at that, it talks about the role of pretrial. And I know, Nick, you also wear the hat of NAPSA president. Do you want to kind of talk to us a little bit about the NAPSA standards
Sure.
as they relate to the role of pretrial?
Sure. Well, and as you can see, there's a lot of similarity, right? The purpose, management, and function of pretrial service agencies, NAPSA Standard 4.1, talks specifically, just like Wes spoke about earlier, the responsibility of pretrial service agencies being there to assist judicial officers in making prompt, fair, and informed bail decisions to promote future court appearance and enhance public safety. And it talks about providing the court with practical risk-based monitoring, supervision, and support options for defendants that require oversight on pretrial release. So there's a lot to unpack in those two statements. They're pretty dense. So what does that actually mean? And one of the things I love about the NAPSA standards, and is that you have these sort of broad statements, and then you have the opportunity for commentary within the standards. So I'd always reference you to go to the actual source document if you want to see a really thorough discussion about what these standards mean. But in 4.1, I'm just going to try to summarize it to some extent. What it means and what they talk about in the commentary is that pretrial service agencies should complete investigations on all defendants charged with a criminal offense who are in custody at the time of their initial court appearance. And this is a key indicator, especially for states, different states, they're eligible for bail according to their controlling statute, right? So we want to recognize that there are some states that have statutes that don't let certain crimes be released at that initial court appearance, and we want to provide for that language within that standard as well. The other key thing that we talk about in the standard is that there should be no additionally limiting factors placed on the individuals who get screened or interviewed or have an investigation. So that means the courts in individual jurisdictions don't get to individually determine, well, we're not screening this type of offense, or you're not screening this type of defendant. The same thing with prosecutors, and same thing with pretrial service agencies. The only people that shouldn't receive screening in this standard are those that are not eligible for bail according to the controlling statute. And that's where the language starts. We start seeing the language that's used sort of in common programs is to talk about universal screening. We are screening everyone who's eligible for release. We also talk about in the standard about aiding decision makers and the use of risk-based monitoring, which means that we as pretrial professionals should be using an actuarial risk assessment tool. Again, I'm assuming the vast majority of our audience will understand what an actuarial risk assessment tool is specifically for pretrial, but again, that's interwoven in the standard. And then we also need to understand, and in the commentary we talk a little bit about how we also need to understand that every actuarial risk assessment tool can obviously not take into consideration every possible situation or scenario. So we advocate for the ability of staff to be able to adjust recommendations based, again, on a predefined list of mitigating or aggravating factors. Finally, we talk also about the federal and state bail statutes that define, again, the purpose of pretrial supervision as promoting future court appearance and behaviors that enhance public safety. So when we're looking at conditions, supervision levels, they have to be tied to those two outcomes. They have to be tied to encouraging future court appearance and addressing behaviors that would enhance public safety. Blanket conditions simply are not acceptable or legally defensible. So our argument is that, again, you get to that individualized bail decision when you take into consideration all those factors and all those things that we talk about in the commentary.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And let's talk about what the NAPSA standards say regarding the purpose of a pretrial risk assessment and things pretrial agencies need to consider.
Sure. So again, 4.4 sort of blanket statements, blanket commentary, talk about the pretrial service agencies' use of validated risk assessment, and that it should be available to pretrial service agencies at the time of the initial bail decision and can be easily defined and quantified. That's two reasons, really. Easy because we want to make sure that it's easy for the stakeholders to understand what we're measuring. We want it to be transparent in that process, but also easily defined and quantified so that we can actually capture data at a later time to be able to validate the tools that we're using. The risk assessments must be able to classify defendants into distinct risk and supervision categories based on assessment scoring. So we want to be able to see, again, no matter what terminology you use, a difference between lower risk individuals and higher risk individuals and how those are grouped. Some jurisdictions and some tools use numbers, some use letters, some don't use either of those. But the idea is that a person who's classified in one group should clearly be performing differently than a person who would be classified in a different group. And then again, we talk about pretrial service agencies should have clear policy and how staff may recommend a release or detention level that does not match the defendant's assessed level. So again, we want to acknowledge that a risk assessment tool is not going to take into consideration every single circumstance. We want to provide some professional discretion as a pretrial practitioner. At the same time, again, we have an obligation not only to our stakeholders, but also our community to be transparent about what those are. We need to be able to track and develop metrics that allow us to track the deviations, the rationale behind it, and also be able to track that on a individual defendant level, but also to be able to track it on a staffing level, again, for a quality assurance purpose. But again, there's another opportunity for us to engage and be involved in the conversations of how our systems are developed. If we're capturing that data in a really sound manner, we have the ability to bring that back, hopefully, to a group of policymakers to discuss why deviations occurred, how often they're occurring, and maybe again raise future questions about how to validate risk assessments and how we should implement risk assessments in our jurisdictions. And then finally, the last piece that we talk about in commentary is, again, the ability or the necessity to require supervisor's approval for recommendations that deviate from risk assessments. And again, the rationale behind that is there's a transparent metric and a transparent dialogue between a particular investigator and their supervisors to make sure that we're trying to limit our own internal biases that we all have when we're doing a risk assessment.
So we'll talk a little bit more about some of those issues, I think, as we go along, particularly, Nick, as you give us a glimpse of what you're doing in Milwaukee. But it seems like, how we approach recommendations and use the risk assessment in that regard, and then how we use it as a strategy for supervision is important. I know in Virginia, we have research that shows that the use of the risk assessment in a structured way improved release rates, also improved our outcomes on supervision. So those things are critical. But another component,
Yeah, obviously differential supervision is something that's ingrained throughout our standards across the board. And we always talk about sort of one of the founding principles of NAPSA. I remember even 20 years ago being taught about this is that, again, we're going to use the least restrictive means necessary to assure court appearance and public safety. That is definitely woven through all of these standards that talk about risk assessment tools, and especially are very important when it comes to validation. If you're not using a validated risk assessment tool, especially a validated or a tool that can be locally validated, you may be making all sorts of errors, either over conditioning or under conditioning, and then also potentially it may result in the detention of low risk defendants as well.
And then, of course, the importance of fidelity and making sure that the instruments being scored properly and the levels are being assigned appropriately, obviously, are important considerations and challenges to agencies. I know in Virginia, but I'm sure across the country, you're now having to develop new capacity to address those issues. But obviously, we need to think about.
And I think it's a developing challenge of the field in general. Again, I shouldn't use the global we, maybe I should, I don't know. But the idea is we, as a field, I think, just simply didn't put as much emphasis on quality assurance and transparency as we probably should have. I think, again, partially it was due to lack of funding, partially it was due to frankly, just poor vision of what a very simple and easy critique of any field is that uses a validated risk assessment is that, hey, who's checking their work? Who's making sure that this is scored correctly? We all make mistakes. We're all human. And especially as we move more towards using technology, it's a lot easier to type in the wrong number than it is to circle the wrong box on a paper form. So we have to consider those quality assurance measures as an integral aspect of the work that we do now.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you guys consider that in your standards, and that's something we need to focus on and build on. So the standards go on to talk about, the instrument in terms of the need for validity and validation and things of that nature. Do you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think, we actually frame these sort of three questions in the standards. We traditionally have just looked at the simplest form of validation. Does the tool predict accurately? And that is, again, a historic context that our field, like many criminal justice fields, have to live with. We have not taken a look at the impact on racial disparities historically. We have not taken a look at the impacts of socioeconomic disparities within the pretrial risk assessment instruments. The need and necessity to review risk assessments routinely, and we talk about doing it every couple of years, is important because the local context is different. When we talk about specifically the PSA, which has been validated on a national data set, that's great. We know from a scientific standpoint that should be generalizable across the country because of the science behind it. At the same time, we also need to understand that individual jurisdictions may be operating with different and unique contexts, and that requires that local validation. I think about the state of Wisconsin, and I think about Milwaukee. Milwaukee is the largest jurisdiction in the entire state by quite a bit. It generally contributes anywhere between 40 and 60% of all criminal justice data, depending on what factor or what type of data you're looking at. So it would be inappropriate for us to validate a tool in Milwaukee and then slam it across the rest of the state. So we have to understand that those contexts exist. And what's really great about the PSA and really great about Arnold Ventures is that they encourage that to actually do the local validation. So this is where the aspect, again, of our field that we don't always do a great job of, and one of the biggest challenges, and one of the challenges that we're throwing at the field within the standard that we sort of touch on but don't really highlight, is the necessity to capture really good data, to be able to quantify and capture your results on a regular basis, and then to have the capacity to either, partner with a university or partner with some sort of scientist to actually do revalidation on your own individual data is so important. And again, this isn't necessarily talked about in the standard, but again, it's interwoven throughout our standards. And then the ability to share it with stakeholders, to get buy-in, to be transparent, to share it with the community members, to say, hey, this is the data that we're getting in our jurisdiction. And then also to have the ability to modify the risk assessment where necessary and when it's appropriate.
So Nick, one of the things, one of the last bullet talks about making sure that the instrument that's created doesn't exacerbate existing racial disparity and in the bail decision-making process. So I know one of the relatively recent critiques of pretrial risk assessment actuarial tools is perhaps some of the baked-in racial bias that may have occurred in kind of the process of more systemic that leads into the data that's collected for the creation of tools and the validation of tools. And I know NAPS has come out with a statement on that. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that and help us kind of navigate that situation?
Yeah, so again, if you're using a validated actuarial tool, especially in the pretrial field, the idea is that should be limiting racial disparities in and of itself. The problem that I think we as a field have to acknowledge is that we are a piece of a much larger criminal justice continuum. The pretrial service agency has a responsibility to mitigate racial disparity at the release, detention, and condition setting stages of the criminal justice system. However, the involvement and the ability to control for law enforcement policies, sentencing policies, Department of Corrections policies, whatever else may be impacting an individual when you're looking at their individualized risk, is something that, frankly, we need to be a champion for criminal justice reform, but we also have to understand what our role is within the greater context. So I think it's something that is definitely something that we need to continue to look at. It's something that we need to continue to strive for. I always use the analogy that these risk assessments, if you're using them accurately, this is an opportunity to sort of take the temperature of racial disparities within the criminal justice system. But when you're looking at the assessment tool in and of itself, again, doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter any of those socioeconomic status, it looks at static factors and says this is what it is. So I think it's something that we will continue to be challenged on. It's something that we need to continue to fight for. It's something that I feel very strongly about, that we need to continue to look at risk assessments and ensure that they're not exacerbating racial disparities. But it's also a difficult topic to talk about because, again, our piece of the puzzle is very minute. I always tell people, you know, when I think about pretrial service agencies, we're lucky if we're brought to the table to talk about criminal justice policies as a whole. So we are very oftentimes the, you know, sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of sitting at the kids' table when we're talking about major criminal justice policy reform. I think we have a stake in this argument. I think we have an ability to provide a ton of data to the people that are making policies about who's coming through the criminal justice system and why they're coming through the criminal justice system. And we have to figure out how to continue to communicate and continue to get better. It's not going away. It's very clear that we haven't solved racial disparities over the last several hundreds of years. And it's not going to go away in the next 5 years because we make some changes to a risk assessment tool. But we need to continue to fight for eliminating racial disparities in every aspect that we can.
So Wes had mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast about kind of why we're here, and mentioned the study conducted by the Virginia Crime Commission, the Virginia State Crime Commission. And so in their 2018 annual report on the Virginia Pretrial Data Project and Pretrial Process, one of the things it described and highlighting in its examination of pretrial services that I kind of highlight here, among other things, was judicial officer decision-making and release in relation to bail considerations or conditions, role of Virginia's pretrial risk assessment instrument, the VPRA, and the utility of pretrial risk assessment in general regarding bail determinations. And so I think when we look at, you know, the Crime Commission report, we're looking at some of the things that we just talked about, you know, the role of pretrial services. We should look at, you know, some of the findings of that they found regarding pretrial. And in particular note, they found that pretrial services is missing a chunk of their role in regards to informing bail decisions. And so first, you know, as Wes kind of pointed out in our model, we're not situated at the magistrate bail hearing. So so right off the bat, you know, there's a chunk of people that are not getting that assessment at the initial hearing. So when Nick talked about universal screening, in the Virginia model, we're coming in a little bit late, and so there's a chunk of people that we're not getting. We're not getting because we're not situated at the magistrate's office, and then some of the people we're missing because they're bonding out before their first court appearance, and they're not available at the time of screening. And so the Crime Commission found that there were significantly more defendants that were placed on pretrial supervision without the benefit of a pretrial investigation. 61% of defendants were directly placed without a pretrial investigation. So, you know, from the perspective of what we're seeing here, you know, it seems kind of like our model, you know, maybe not as effective, or how we're approaching this in terms of what, you know, we talked about in the Code of Virginia and the NAPSA standards, that you know, what we're doing is informing bail decisions that are prompt, fair, and promoting future court appearance and enhancing public safety. So you know, Wes, Nick, you know, any thoughts about that and what these findings show?
Yeah, I'll go first. I mean, yeah, maybe we are equitable and fair in the ones that we reach, but clearly we do not reach all defendants who come in contact with our criminal justice system and are charged with a criminal offense. And so it goes back to, you know, the NAPSA standards of essentially universal screening. We clearly do not practice universal screening in Virginia, and that is a clear gap in our current model. And so I guess the argument definitely could be made that we are not contributing to the fair and equitable practice of justice in our system, just because solely we just cannot, in our current framework, reach all of the defendants who come in our system. And even the ones that we do get, when we come into contact with them, we do not even do universal screening of those individuals based off of various reasons, whether that's they are intoxicated, a medical issue, language barriers, whether they are behavior issues, or even just flat out decline to be interviewed by pretrial services. So even within the ones that we do come into contact with, there is a clear gap in that. And so I guess, yes, the argument could definitely be made that we are not meeting that fair and equitable baseline that we would like to get to.
Yeah, well, I completely agree, Wes. I think that's a great comment. I think, you know, my background, I have a master's degree in public administration. So when I see numbers like this, I always sort of go back to like the accountant side and my a little brief accounting training in grad school. You know, what that tells me is that you have 61% of the folks that are placed on pretrial supervision. We don't know if we're over-conditioning those folks. We don't know if we're under-conditioning those folks. We don't know if they should be released. We don't know if they should be detained. And we have to look at pretrial supervision, just like we do local jails, as a limited resource. So again, that's the concern that I would have from a data capture point and just from a system evaluation point, is that we don't know. And to me, when I look at it from, you know, a judicial perspective, without having that pretrial risk assessment tool, without having that additional information, I'd be really curious as to how they're making these decisions. I've had some really honest and open conversations with judicial officials in my career, and they have described some of their bail setting decisions as golfing in the fog. So they put the ball down, they hit it out, and they think they made the right decision, but they have no idea where it ends up. So I think, again, this is an important conversation for Virginia to tackle, is how do you get to that 61%? Because, you know, even if we look at the outcomes, we don't know even if we just got the outcomes for that 61%, we wouldn't know if that is, we're overperforming, underperforming, performing right where we expected, because we have no idea what risk level those folks are. So it's hard to even evaluate the overall success of that population without having that risk assessment tool.
So, and you know, one of our challenges is in Virginia is we do not have unlimited resources. And so, Nick, it sounds like, you know, if judicial officers in our model are making, how did you phrase it? Golfing in the dark?
Golfing in the fog.
Golfing in the fog when it comes to, you know, releasing and applying conditions, and quite frankly, a rather resource intensive condition such as pretrial supervision. that, there should be sort of, a context of who that target population should be, and they don't have the benefit of that. So that could result in potentially over conditioning and a group of defendants that are getting a restriction on liberty that maybe don't need it, or maybe aren't getting the right dosage because maybe they actually are high risk. Is that kind of?
Yeah, well, and when you think about a system, like let's hypothetically say, okay, we're going to start from scratch. Virginia has no pretrial services, we're going to start from scratch. The first recommendation I would make with any jurisdiction is start doing a risk assessment to find out what your supervision needs are in the first place. Out of the 61%, how many of folks could have been completely successful without any forms of conditions, without any forms of supervision? And then that allows you to allocate your resources again accordingly. But it's hard to do that without this information.
So Wes, from your perspective, when you get a placement, either a direct placement from a magistrate or a judge, do you see some of what Nick described in that, in terms of conditions and the amount of resources that you have to devote that may not correspond with their risk level? Is that something you see?
Sure, there are definitely plenty of instances where we would get a direct referral that if there would have been a pretrial risk assessment done on the forefront, if the recommendation would have been released with no conditions. And we've also received plenty of direct referrals where it would have been detained, and yet they are releasing them with minimal conditions. It's very much all across the spectrum from one end to the other. And yes, there are cases where folks are released with very, I would say, low-level nonviolent misdemeanor offenses with a conditions list attached where almost every box of a possible bail order are checked for their conditionings, which clearly is not least restrictive means necessary to ensure their appearance in court and the public safety. And so, yes, anecdotally, there are plenty of cases just like that. And I would say even more so right now, just under the current arena in which we are operating in, due to the COVID-19, which I think we're going to touch on a little bit later. And so that direct placement piece of the puzzle for Virginia is a very key and critical, effectively able to resource to the risk appropriately within our agencies. Because if we are getting a vast majority of people by direct placements who otherwise would not have been recommended for pretrial supervision as a condition of their release, then we are taking resources away from those individuals who do need or could benefit from pretrial services as a condition of release, and not able to adequately supervise those individuals in the community.
Yeah, and Ken, I would just add, I just want to make sure that this is not a critique of the pretrial service agencies, right? This is sort of a critique of the system model and the structure that the state of Virginia is operating under. It's really, no individual stakeholder's responsibility that this is the system that you've got. But it is given the magistrate structure is what you guys have to deal with moving forward. Yeah.
So looking at the data following the report, FY 2019, I think we can see that there was some progress that was made regarding the direct placements, but it appears that we're still kind of struggling with this topic or this issue. So it looks like 53% of all placements in FY19 were without the benefit of a pretrial investigation. So my question, and we kind of touched on some of the issues, but and our investigation rate for FY19 was 61%. What does that do to the credibility of pretrial services if we're not hitting the mark like we should? Anything about that you can? Any thoughts about that?
So for me, I mean, it would open the door for saying what's the point of a pretrial investigation in Virginia if we are trending way below getting universal screening across the board. You have, like Nick said, no real comparative qualities with that, with a population that do not receive those risk assessments. I mean, we have no way of really knowing without, especially as it relates to the VPRA, which in our system requires a face-to-face interview with someone to gather some of the dynamic risk factors that we measure. And so with that, we have a big opportunity to come under some maybe not necessarily completely warranted scrutiny, but we open ourselves up to that scrutiny because we miss such a large portion of the population that we would come into contact with otherwise. And so, yes, it is a systemic problem. And even within our own avenue of meeting those individuals, we still miss a large number of those that we would otherwise be eligible for a pretrial investigation, just for those reasons that we've noted earlier of behavior, mental health, crises situations, behavior not conducive to interviews, and those sorts of things that screen or that do not allow for that investigation to take place in that moment. So how can you feasibly be measured of whether or not it is beneficial and what our current practices are? Is it meaningful data to be able to not have that 59% or 49, 39%, goodness gracious, math in public, to compare to, so it's difficult, and I think we are susceptible to scrutiny in that regard.
Yeah, and I would bring up one other potential, and I'm hesitant to bring this up because, again, like I said, I'm a huge advocate, obviously, for pretrial services, but it calls into question any validation that's been done on the VPRA as well. If you're missing 39% of the population, is that 39%? Is there a reason why you're missing that 39%? Is that now the 61% that you have, not a random sampling of everyone that's coming into the system? I don't know that. You guys may have a better understanding of that. But again, if I was just a complete outsider, I'd be like, okay, well, you only screened 61%. How do I not know? That could just be the 61% in a specific jurisdiction. It could be 61% that only encompass certain types of cases. It could be 61% of people that fit under, whatever other category you want to add, and therefore you're ignoring 39% of the population that should be included in any validation study. So again, just when we were talking about those standards earlier, 4.4 talking about validation, that's another sort of real life concern when you're taking a look at the data that you have access to.
Yeah, and whether or not that 61% is it people that we've handpicked to be interviewed, is that where bias comes into place for an investigator? Heaven forbid, they are screening within the screening tool, so those sorts of questions come up because there is such a gap like that. You don't want, as a program manager, I would like to have lots of faith in my investigator to know that they are screening appropriately. But when you see such large gaps, those questions tend to creep in your mind when you look at it from a much larger view across the system.